Right?
Yeah, you look great.
Excellent. All right. Well, Robert, it's very good to be with you all here today. Indeed, at my age, it's very good to be anywhere. One of my favourite political stories concerns two federal Liberal parliamentarians, both of whom were later knighted. The first is arguably Australia's most hopeless and most devious Prime Minister, William Mcmahon, usually known as Billy. Billy Mcmahon was Prime Minister from March 1971 until December 1972, when the Conservative coalition lost office to Labor under Gough Whitlam. And Whitlam had famously described and very accurately described McMahon as, quote, Tiberius with a telephone. The second federal Liberal parliamentarian is James, usually known as Jim Killen, later on Sir James Killen, who liked more than the odd beer on a hot day and who had served as Minister for the Navy under John Gorton. But as soon as McMahon became Prime Minister, he dropped Jim Killen from the ministry. In 1972, in the Federal Liberal Party room, McMahon mused and said out loud, "Sometimes I think I'm my own worst enemy." To which Jim Killen called out, "Not while I'm alive." Does anyone find that funny? But I'm not primarily here to canvass the humour of politicians. This afternoon, as Robert explained, I'm speaking about co-writing political satire in Australia. And this involves focusing on the 8 fictions I've so far written about the life and times of Dr. Professor Grafton Everest. 3 of these Grafton Everest adventures I have penned, and in my case, literally, because I write with a pen, I penned with my mate from Brisbane, Ian McFadden, of Comedy Company fame. These 3 Grafton adventures are The Lowest Depths, The Dizzying Heights, and Going Out Backwards. The latter, Going Out Backwards, was shortlisted for Australia's only award for humour writing, which is the biannual Russell Prize. All of these books, plus a 4th entertainment called So Far So Good, released in 2018 and co-authored with the ABC broadcaster Anthony Fennell, are published by the nimble Melbourne-based Hybrid Publishers. And to digress, So Far So Good got its name after my friend Ian McFadden came down to here in Sydney to encourage his daughter who was trying to get into NIDA. And he took his daughter out to a Chinese restaurant. And they were the only Europeans in the restaurant. And as soon as the first course was served, the Chinese owner said, "So far, so good." And after the second, "So far, so good." And after the third course, "So far, so good," which gave Ian and his daughter a terrible feeling that something terrible was going to happen. Anyway, the 8th Grafton Everest fiction, The Lowest Depths, which bookends the 7th one, The Dizzying Heights. The Lowest Depths was released late last year. In previous books, Grafton Everest has been a lecturer in well-being and life skills at the University of Mangoland. He's been an independent Mangoland senator holding the balance of power. He was an envoy to Great Britain, and briefly Grafton became the first president of the Republic of Australia. Now, as I've explained many times to the media, because most of the media want to know, are you Grafton Everest? But I've tried to explain many times to the media that my hapless anti-hero Grafton Everest is what I could be or could become if I really let myself go. But regarding Grafton holding the balance of power in the Senate, it might be of interest to know, some of you might find it interesting to know, that in the federal election of 2016, as a former member of the Queensland Parole Board and the New South Wales State Parole Authority, I stood as the Australian Sex Party's lead candidate for New South Wales. Our leader was Fiona Patten. Some of you may know she's a very successful upper house member in Victoria these days. But I stood as the Australian Sex Party's lead candidate for New South Wales, and running with the motto, "Your life, your choice," we came within a whisker of beating the Christian Democrats led by the Reverend Fred Nile. In terms of this interesting conference's theme, the humour of politics and the politics of humour, Ian McFadgen and I find it fascinating that however fanciful our satire, it so often gets gazumped by political reality and academic reality. In a novel published in 1990 by Pan Macmillan, Busy in the Fog, of which I was the sole author, I made Grafton's loyal, long-suffering wife Janet a lecturer in fibre art. Lo and behold, a year later, a Queensland regional university appointed a woman to a lectureship in fibre art. And again, to digress, Busy in the Fog got its name. Lyndall and I and our daughter Emerald were in London for quite a while. And we went to see Carl Jung's house in Kuschnack in Lake Zurich. And as a result of that, I started work with a Jungian analyst in London, Dr. Costello. And after three or four sessions, I said to him, "Well, how do you think I'm doing?" And he said, "Ross, I think you're busy in the fog." So that's how Busy in the Fog, which was published in 1990, got its name. The climax of Busy in the Fog features the flooding of Brisbane and its surrounds due to a collapse of the Wivenhoe Dam, which, as I discovered, is actually built on a fault. Just a minute. Yeah, so it's actually built on a fault. And eerily, this anticipated the 2011 floods that ravaged southeast Queensland. Other predictions, if that's what they are, include the fact that in Going Out Backwards, Grafton is sent to review the curriculum at his alma mater. He finds that all the subjects in the traditional tertiary curriculum, history, languages, geography, economics, have been relegated to a single faculty called Legacy Studies. In years since, the role of the humanities has been increasingly diminished, and its students must pay substantially higher fees. And this is because humanities subjects are deemed non-contributory. They're deemed non-contributory to society and political economy. The book, Going Out Backwards, also predicts the general movement of universities towards being primarily profit-making businesses. In Going Out Backwards, Grafton is appointed to a committee investigating the effect of human activity on continental drift. It is believed that mining, the weight of buildings, planes landing and pogo sticks are accelerating crustal sliding, which will lead to more earthquakes, volcanoes, and possibly continental collisions. The following year, people in Oklahoma alleged that fracking in oil wells was leading to an increased incident of earthquakes in that state. In our seventh entertainment, The Dizzying Heights, which I co-wrote with Ian Mcmahon, Grafton visits the United States, where civil war has broken out between supporters of former President Ronald Thump, and a left-wing coalition named the Sanders Misters, if you get the pun. Shortly after this adventure was published, in an unprecedented event, supporters of Donald Trump attacked the Capitol building in Washington in a violent attempt to shut the government down. In the November 2021 issue of Quadrant magazine, the Tasmanian writer and artist Neil Price wrote about the Grafton Everest fictions that, quote, "It is unprecedented in Australia and perhaps in the English-speaking world for 8 political sexual satires to be written chronologically following the development of the same set of key characters. As Neil Price suggests, the closest are P.G. Wodehouse's comic novels about the bumbling Bertie Wooster and his hugely intelligent manservant Jeeves. But these characters, especially Bertie Wooster and Jeeves, do not develop. And Wodehouse has a stationary sense of time. When my first Grafton Everest entertainment, Pushed from the Wings, was published in Australia in 1986, I was then a beleaguered lecturer at Brisbane's Griffith University. For my sins, I was also a leading activist against the authoritarian regime of Sir Johannes Bjelke-Petersen, usually known as Joe, whose government was making it increasingly difficult for me to get my non-fiction works published. In 1984, Volume 2 of my History of Queensland, from 1915 to the early 1980s, was pulped, and Sir Joe's Attorney General publicly threatened me with criminal libel. There hadn't been a criminal libel case in Australia since Frank Hardy's Power Without Glory. And because I looked like I was going into the slammer and it looked like we were going to get sued, we transferred all of my assets over to my darling wife, Lyndall. Now, eventually, a revised version of the book was published. I don't know whether I should say this, but if anyone's got a copy of from 1915 to the 1980s, and the index mentions Sir Walter Campbell, that might be worth a quid or two. At the same time as I was getting hammered by Joe and his henchmen, my opponents at Griffith University were trying to get me sacked. Some of these were graduates from French universities, including the Sorbonne, who ran the ludicrous line that the text writes itself, and who couldn't get a job anywhere other than what they regarded as a provincial university in blighted Australia. Hence, I was caught in an academic and political pincer. When I raised these distressing but not dangerous problems with Broken Hill Jack, my long-time confidant in Alcoholics Anonymous, Jack paused and said, "Don't feel they're using you, laddie. Start to feel that you're using them." As a result of Jack's sage advice, I started taking copious notes about what was happening to and around me. This included transcribing university minutes, one of which actually stated unanimous, with one exception. That's true. Shortly afterwards, a zealous follower of the notoriously abstruse and transgressive philosopher Michel Foucault and his former student Jacques Derrida, this follower was standing in front of me at the local National Bank at Griffith University. When he complained that because he had to attend so many committee meetings, he didn't have time for writing, out of my mouth came these words that I couldn't put back, but out of my mouth came these words: "I think if you had something to say, Peter, you'd probably find the time to write it down." As you might imagine, that went down like a Led Zeppelin. Indeed, that conversation he never forgot. And again, I won't say that. Published in 1986, Push from the Wings lampooned both life at the University of Mangoland and contemporary political shenanigans in uber reactionary Queensland. Although my first political sexual fiction didn't portray a simple left-right divide, it did follow the maxim of the late great stand-up comedian Mort Sahl, that nothing is off limits to the true satirist, who should have a go at everything and everyone. And in fact, Mort Sahl's memoir, Heartland, is one of my favourite books. Mort Sahl died recently, aged 92. Anyway, following Sahl's maxim that nothing is off limits to the true satirist who should have a go at everything and everyone, hence in Push from the Wings, Bjelke Peterson became the odious Sir Otis Hogstraten, while at the novel's end, Grafton's leading university opponent gets his comeuppance by being obliterated by a bazooka. Sales of the book in Australia was certainly helped by a review by Barry Humphries published in Quadrant. In a glowing endorsement, Humphries wrote, quote, "Grafton Everest is a wonderful creation, whom I would place without question in the ranks of Philip Portnoy and Kingsley Amos's Lucky Jim," end of quote. Push from the Wings was followed by All About Anthrax, which was published in Australia in 1987, also by Hale and Ironmonger for Sydney publishers. It again featured my teetotal Panama hat wearing corpulent key character. When the first two Grafton Everest adventures were republished in England in 1989 in Corgi Bantam's prestigious Black Swan series, they sold well in South Africa and Great Britain. This is in part because they are reminiscent of Tom Sharp's over-the-top sexual political satires set in South Africa under Afrikaner rule. This was also because in the London Observer, under the headline Conquering Everest, the Booker Prize-winning author Howard Jacobson wrote a rave review of both books. On the back cover of each novel, as well as including Barry Humphries' endorsement, Corgi Bantam cleverly highlighted 4 words from a humorless critic's utterly negative review published in the Melbourne Age, quote, "I never laughed once." And we put that on the back cover. Since then, I found that it's often helpful to tip negative criticism on its head. When I was in London in 1989 publicising both books, I had an appointment at Faber & Faber. I've never forgotten what I saw on entering the esteemed publisher's office. A framed photo featured in large print the following words: "There is no excuse for criticism, Basil Bunting." As it happens, Basil Bunting, the bearded British modernist who died in Northumberland in 1985, was and remains one of my favourite poets. Indeed, his lengthy 5-part autobiographical poem, Brig Flats, published in 1966, is rightly regarded as a worthy successor to Ezra Pound's cantos and T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. Some of you, including Connell, may know that my wife and friend of 45 years, Lyndall Moore Fitzgerald, died in 2020. In the latest fictive offering, The Lowest Depth, which I've co-authored with Mcmahon, Grafton's beloved wife, Janet, is away with a sisterly coven on a 6-month world tour. As a result, Grafton is even more rudderless than usual. To further complicate matters, lured by a sizable advance, Grafton has been persuaded to attempt to write his memoir. Early on, researching his family history, Grafton finds an unsent letter addressed to somewhere in Russia, written by his late mother to a brother he never knew he had. Even though in life, Grafton's mother, Avis Everest, who had once been a spy, even though in life Avis Everest would lie when telling the truth would do, this did not seem to be a subterfuge. Hoping to track down his mysterious half-sibling, Grafton accepts an offer from the United Nations to head an investigation into electoral fraud in Russia, allegedly orchestrated by the hugely powerful President Vladimir Putin. Going to Russia also enables Grafton to escape his extreme woke daughter Leanne, his impecunious son-in-law Wayne Singlet, and his supposedly gifted grandchild Justice. All three have come to stay with him in the Sydney suburb of Redfern. En route to Moscow, Grafton is contacted by the CIA, who suspect that the Russians are creating a mind control drug under the guise of developing a coronavirus vaccine. Get that? Coronavirus vaccine. Before travelling to the icy wastes of Siberia, in Moscow, Grafton stays at the magnificent Metropole Hotel with its lavish Rococo interiors. There he meets his old Melbourne Boys High School biology teacher, longtime mentor, and former husband of the late Avis Everest, the mysterious Lee Horton. As Grafton soon discovers, the now gender-fluid Mr. Horton has been shadowing him all along in various disguises. As well as Grafton, Grafton wives Janet and Nanny Neal, who was morphed into There are three characters that feature prominently. As well as Mr. Horton, Grafton's wife Janet and Nanny Neal, who was morphed into a hyper male survivalist, they all feature prominently. In fact, these three key characters appear in all 8 Grafton Everest adventures. But in The Lowest Depth, along with Grafton himself, it is Russia and its corrupt and dictatorial president for life, Vladimir Putin, who takes centre stage. These days, Grafton is slightly hearing impaired and walks with the aid of a sparkling cane, which resembles a wand. But none of these impediments prevent Grafton's relentless persistence, which remains his strongest and his weakest quality. In tune with the above, an avid Queensland reader, David Isherwood, singles out for praise an old Russian proverb that I made up, namely, all that trembles does not fall. As Mr. Isherwood points out, this accurately sums up what often happens to Grafton in his many adventures. As always, Grafton's obsession with food takes centre stage, revealing as it does his deeply Freudian problem of oral incorporation. It's as if, by devouring everything in his path, he might somehow understand what life, and more importantly, his life, is about. As eventuates in all 8 novels, in the lowest depths, Grafton is drawn ever closer to a cataclysm. In this case, he faces the likelihood of being drowned in the world's deepest lake, Lake Baikal, located in eastern Siberia. In the anodyne world of 21st century writing, our upfront quote from Gray and Green, "What fun is there in writing if one doesn't go too far?" That this upfront quote, "What fun is there in writing if one doesn't go too far," serves as a warning to the current politically correct woke generation. Hence, the lowest depths opens at a writers' festival, where as keynote speaker, Grafton attempts to reinstate Captain Cook as the discoverer of Australia. Our latest political satire also asks uncomfortable questions about colour casting in the entertainment industry, which according to 2 reviewers, actually caused them to gasp. In a different favourable review, one critic wrote that the name Grafton Everest obviously stood for graft and avarice. Although, as far as I know, it didn't, I thought it only polite to simply say thank you. Actually, our Panama hat-wearing anti-hero got his name when in the mid-1970s, one of my political science students at the University of New South Wales, John, otherwise known as Johnny Sheens, and I drove from Swaziland into Mozambique. As it happened, we made a mozza at the casino in Swaziland and converted it into Portuguese currency, which was only able to be used inside Mozambique. At a time we went in, at a time when Frelimo, excuse me, that's diet ginger beer. Actually, someone came and interviewed me from the ABC recently, and I like drinking a lot of liquid. And it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was drinking some of this diet ginger beer. And the interviewer said, "It's a bit early to be drinking, isn't it, Ross?" And I said, "Well, that's diet ginger beer, and I haven't had a drink of alcohol for 51.5 years. You know what he said? He said, "Surely you can have one now." Anyway, a lot of stupid people in the world. Anyway, Johnny Sheens and I drove from Swaziland into Mozambique. At a time when Frelimo guerrillas were driving out the colonialists, we were actually the only Europeans heading into what had been since 1505 a Portuguese territory. When we crossed the border, I asked a guard, "What are things like now that the Portuguese are going?" His answer, "It's the same pile of manure, only some of the flies are different." Shortly afterwards, we saw 2 large vans fleeing Mozambique's capital city, Lourenço Marques, since 1976 Maputo. All of these vehicles were emblazoned on the side with a huge sign, "Grafton Everest Removals." Even though my first political sexual satire was not published until a decade later, at the time I said to Johnny Sheens, "Grafton Everest, what a great name for a central character and for his mother, who, although not often visible, hovers over her son like the mountain." In Lourenço Marques, we were among a handful of Europeans staying at what was then the opulent Hotel Turismo. As there were very few guests, we were allocated the penthouse. One afternoon, to the sound of gunfire in the nearby city centre, we played croquet on the hotel's immaculate lawn. It was all reminiscent of After Us the Deluge. Writing can be a very lonely business, so being in partnership with Ian McFadgen has been a hoot. Here is the way we work. In all our Grafton Everest offerings, I provide the key characters and the beginning and ending of each book. I also constantly phone or email Ian, who lives in Queensland, with a raft of ideas, suggestions, and a series of seemingly unconnected lines and questions. Then our chapter drafts go back and forth to each other. In our latest joint venture, I wrote the opening and the final chapters. Ian, who was brilliant at plotting, filled in all the details and provided a draft of the chapters in between. The result is what the book's blurb terms a plot full of twists and turns that would make an Olympic gymnast proud. It was extremely pleasing for Ian and me to read Neil Price's statement that in the previous Grafton Everest novels, quote, it was relatively easy to see how Fitzgerald, who created all the characters, loads the jokes, while McFadden's comedic timing pulls the trigger. But in the lowest depths, the writing is utterly seamless, end of quote. Now, in terms of co-writing, here's a message from Narangba, north of Brisbane. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ian McFadden, speaking to you now through the voice of Ross Fitzgerald. It's a strange situation, but it might be of assistance if, as you listen, you try to imagine that it is not Ross speaking, but someone younger and better looking. One of my jobs in coming on board as a comedy gun for hire, a kind of have pen will travel on the Grafton Everest books, was to solve a problem. The first 4 Grafton Everest novels were inspired by Ross's tricky time at a Queensland university. They followed the adventures of a luckless professor, not unlike Ross himself, who was caught between 2 opposing and equally repellent groups. His academic colleagues, who believed the prime purpose of a university was to ignite socialist rebellion, and on the other, a viciously bigoted, venal, racist government focused primarily on using their political position and power to make as much money for themselves as possible. The unfortunate professor, who eschewed membership of either faction, was inevitably branded an enemy of both, but managed to survive, mainly due to the propensity of both groups to self-destruct. The problem was that after the 4th book, Ross retired and moved to Sydney, and therefore his alter ego Grafton did as well. The question became, what might Grafton do now? About 15 years ago, I was working on a television comedy series about a young man with no political experience who was elected to the state government and finds he holds the balance of power in the House. This was around the time when candidates from minor parties suddenly found themselves in the Australian Senate despite very low vote counts, thanks to what was called preference whispering. Unfortunately, although I thought this was a chance to do an Australian yes minister, I could not find a television network that was interested. The head of comedy at the ABC didn't think it had any potential, but talking to Ross about his books, I asked if this might not be a story for Grafton. Might he not be elected without even his knowledge to the Australian Senate and hold the casting vote, meaning both sides of politics would be falling over themselves to court his favour? Ross agreed, and that book became Going Out Backwards, where Grafton enters unwittingly into federal politics. In the next 3 books, Grafton journeyed into more and more uncharted territory. He went to London to foil a right-wing coup. He became the first president of the new Republic of Australia, in which role he travelled to the United States, where both the Democratic and Republican parties were so impressed by him, they wondered if he might be the American president as well. And in the latest book, as Ross has explained, he becomes head of the United Nations delegation sent into Russia. The common factor in all these adventures is that Grafton has no idea how he got into these situations, nor what he is supposed to do. But somehow he not only survives, but succeeds. Enjoyable these books are, however, it is important to point out that they don't sell many copies. Of course, which is a phrase I, Ross, dislike. Of course, I admit no blame in regard to the books themselves. The problem arises from the realities of publishing social and political satire in Australia. Australia is a very small market for books, unless they are books written by a sporting hero, a retired politician, or a television or radio personality. Apart from celebrity memoirs and numerous compilations, the only Australian authors who make money tends to be those who sell books internationally. And that means that those books have to be appealing to international readers. The first Grafton books had some success overseas because the situation in the books was the situation in most universities in the 1980s. The battle of left-wing academics and right-wing governments was an instantly recognisable, shall we say, relatable topic in many countries. The downside of sending Grafton on a journey into Australian politics is that the targets of the satire are less relatable to people in other markets, which have different political systems. A parallel example of this problem is my experience in exporting television programs. In the late 80s, I produced a program called The Comedy Company, which became increasingly popular, principally due to a set of regular characters who represented a cross-section of Australian people, among them a surly schoolgirl, a Greek fruiterer, an aged pensioner, and a young bloke who was one of the permanently unemployed. A couple of years later, I sold the series to British television in a condensed version. Against what you might expect, in cutting it down, it was those very characters that got removed. Although they were popular in Australia, they weren't familiar to British audiences. England didn't have Greek fruiterers, it had Pakistani fruiterers. And the accents and slang of characters like Kylie Mole and Colin Carpenter would have been unintelligible to British audiences. It is also the case that despite its clever writing and excellent production values, the Gillies report would not work overseas. Audiences would not appreciate the impersonations, not knowing the people who were being impersonated. Of course, Suzanne, that phrase again, there is no such limitation going the other way. Although we are less knowledgeable about British politics than we once were, Australians still watch programs that satirise American, French or Russian politics because through international media, we know many of the characters. Donald Trump has probably done more to promote the export of American political satire than anyone in history. So there we have a problem. The more culturally exact, to use the late Bob Ellis's term, a satirical book or television program is, the more its audience is likely to be limited to Australian readers. Now, as Ross has mentioned, the latest book, The Lowest Depths, is substantially set in Russia. Will this mean a greater chance of international sales? Perhaps, but given its portrayal of the Russian president, it could also mean a greater chance of Novichok poisoning. Those not incompatible outcomes aside, as our cinema and television becomes even more dominated by not only American and British product, but Korean, Swedish, German and French entertainments, my advice to anyone wanting to do satirical television or write numerous books about Australian politics or Australian politics is that by all means do it for love, and you might make a few dollars, but don't give up your day job, end quote. Back to me then. That's it, folks. As Dame Edwin used to say, thanks for having me, and I mean that metaphorically. Any questions?
Many thanks for that, Ross. Do we have any questions? Any? No one ready to go off the bat? Well, I have one I prepared earlier. You talk about the novels as entertainments, and one of the things that these conferences always address, and have particularly addressed on this occasion, is a balance between entertainment and humour and making a point. Can you talk about the way, I mean, are you pursuing arguments, or are you, I don't really believe in mere entertainment, but are you merely entertaining?
No.
What's the balance?
No, my aim is not to be merely entertaining. My aim is to draw attention to the current ludicrous situations in which we find ourselves. So if you take the case of the first novel, after my volume 2 of my history of politics was pulped and I was threatened with criminal libel, I switched into writing about Queensland politics in a satirical way. And up to now, at least, nobody's attempted to sue me. Whereas in my academic work, I was also sued by a leading Labor Party luminary. So up to now, nobody's willing to stand up and say this ludicrous, venal, vicious person is obviously me. So, so the answer is there's always a serious intent.
Thank you.
And I mean, in the most recent one, The Lowest Depths, which is substantially set in Russia, there's a very clear intent about revealing Vladimir Putin's dictatorship.
Is it your sense that it's working less well than it used to? I've done a lot of work on political satire, and it seems the more there is, and the more the politicians, it doesn't function as a shaming mechanism as it is, at least in theory, supposed to. Have you observed any change in that over the time you've been doing this?
That's very interesting. I suppose what you're saying is that politicians have got used to having their shameful activities and statements revealed, and therefore it doesn't knock them around as much. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that, but that's. But political satire isn't properly recognised in Australia yet, I don't think.
Jessica.
Ross, do you think there ever was a time when politicians were shamed by political satire in Australia? I don't.
I think Joe, despite his protestations, he found the Max Gillies and Jerry Connolly's portraits of him to be, he didn't like them one little bit. But it's hard to know, Jessica.
So it's hotly debated amongst this strange mob of people who study humour.
Yes.
What the impact of satire in general, but political satire in particular, is. What's more important, that an elite readership access your books, including the targets, or a mass market? Which do you think might be more efficacious?
Oh, a mass readership. And it's a bit like when I was an Australian Senior Research Fellow, I wrote 2 political biographies, one of Red Ted Theodore and one of Australia's only communist member of Parliament, Fred Patterson. And I got interviewed and was asked, and they did, and we did 2 ABC docos about Red Ted Theodore and Fred Patterson. And a reporter asked me, what's the difference between the book and the documentary? And I said, about 750,000 people.
So following up on that, do you have any stories of impact of responses to your work by individuals or any political effect? My favourite story of this kind, which I've used often, is Judith Brett. Argues that when the chaser crew broke into the APEC APEC car thingy,
Security court.
yeah, and that broke. She argues, or she assertion that whole John Howard's image as a strong politician, that he'd been parading this as an image of his strength. He just looked. He started subsequently to look like a silly old man. Now, there was more going on than that, but I also think there's a general truth in that. Have you got any story?
Well, I think Judith's right, but I think there was more impact on the security services rather than on Mr. Howard. The security services were made to look absolute gooses and dills.
Do you want to elaborate on how they reacted to that?
No.
Okay, more questions? Oh, thank you. Yes.
I think it was quite early on in your talk that you mentioned the idea that a satirist has to be willing and able to satirize everything. I would question that and question whether what you are able to satirize depends on where you are positioned in society and whether you are taking a target that, like a politician who is a public figure and worthy of criticism, someone like Joe Edison, or whether, in essence, you are punching up or punching down when you satirize.
Robert, can you? I have hearing aids here.
Yeah, so the question is about. What do you want to?
Just do it slowly. That's all.
Yeah. The question is about you say you quote Sal saying you should satirise everything, but the question is about whether in fact you should distinguish between punching up at valid targets like public figures, politicians, and punching down, and I take it punching down at less valid targets.
Yes, well, that my satire goes at the powerful, is directed mainly at the powerful, not to the dispossessed. So I very much take on board what that last questioner said.
Thanks, Ross. Yes.
Ross, so what have you had any thoughts about the apparent decline of academic satire, or the genre of the academic novel, satirical academic novel? I noted that you observed that Grafton stopped inhabiting, when he stopped inhabiting the academy, he moved on to other things.
Yes.
Have we all moved on to other things? Is the academy no longer as powerful as it once was?
Well, it's certainly not as powerful, and it's certainly not as independent, and it's certainly not as valuable in terms of what it actually does. It's very hard to satirise academic life. I mean, as McFadden and I, we got constantly surprised at how real life very soon follows. I mean, I use that example of me making up that lecturer in fibre art, and a year later, lo and behold, a Queensland University appoints a lecturer in fibre art. Some people mightn't find the notion of fibre art funny, but at the time, it amused me.
Yes, Jessica.
I'm waiting for his first university to create the Faculty of Legacy Studies. I reckon that's a real goer, Ross.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. Well, thank you all for having me, and thank you, Jessica, in particular, and Robert and Darryl and Connell.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much in turn, Ross. That's been fascinating. I also love the stories about how that you just alluded to about satire predicting things. My favourite couplet on that's from Alexander Pope: "Feign what I will and paint it ne'er so strong. Some rising genius sings up to my song." The risk of writing satire is that it becomes documentary within minutes.
And
So,
if you could tell, that I think there are some flyers about the latest Grafton Everest.
there are. I've waved them around once, and I shall wave it around again.
We'll pass them around.
Out on the table, we've got plenty of flyers to have
Okay.
our lunch. So thank you very much for a really enjoyable
Good.
speech for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Now, there we go.